Trap of love, yeah, it's out to get you. Secret message. This is Truth Seekers. I'm Mike Fishkin. This is Vern Bissell. Today is December 10th, 2016. We're in that December, in case you're watching our program now, you can call in live, in between when we have a new president-elect and he has not taken office yet, and you know who I'm talking, but we're not getting into that. We are on bigger topics than presidents. This program likes to talk about, is there meaning to life? Can we know if there's meaning to life? Got some great quotes from Einstein that I'd like to give you to open the program. Then we're going to show some great film you haven't seen before. We're going to show sections of film like we usually do, and you can call in and ask questions if you're watching. Many people don't know that we're on the air these days because of some problems we've had, and we're not on every week like we used to be years ago. But ponder this question for a moment or two before we jump into our first section of film. And the question is, whether you're an atheist or whether you're an agnostic, if you believe, we all have a mystery. And this program is about discussing a mystery here. The major mystery is, where do we all come from? Where are we going to? Those are the major mysteries of life. And there really is an answer of where did we come from and where are we going to. We're going to be talking about both of those. But I want to bounce this off of you. Many people don't think about this. I think adults tend to give up when they're around, before they become adults, when they're around 12 or 13, many. Like, where did you're stuck with a mystery either way. It's not science. The mystery is, where did the universe come from? The first element, the first particle, for those who believe in a Big Bang, in that through natural processes the universe evolved, well, where did the first particle to start it all going come from? No one has that answer. How do you go from nothing to something? But yet, modern science, most of the atheist evolutionists will say, there was a Big Bang. It started from nothing. There is no God. It started from nothing. Well, how does that happen? Our mind can't. That's a wild thought. Maybe it's true. The other one is there a mind involved? And if that's true, you have a mystery too. Where did the mind come from?
And consciousness.
And consciousness.
I have an introduction.
Go ahead.
Comment also.
Make that.
Well, yeah, this program is about truth. We believe absolutely in the Creator God, who's created all things, given life, gives us life, will call us into account at a future time. I heard on the radio just coming in that tomorrow, December 11th, is the most popular, if that's the right word, day of the year for people to defriend other people. Maybe because they didn't want to get them a Christmas present, or maybe they're in a relationship and with family coming into town, they don't want to introduce this friend to family. You know, there can be embarrassing things. Maybe this is the time, by the time you finish our program tonight, to defriend the dark side. The dark side is the one that denies the existence of God, that says we're just out here spinning in space without purpose, this third rock from the sun. Don't go there. Just as Michael has mentioned, life, the brain, but consciousness, hope, beauty, all of these things that are far beyond the material, the physical realm. These are the things that really make life important. So maybe this is your night to defriend the dark side. Or maybe tomorrow, the 11th of December.
And a lot of people who are in the dark side, like I was for a while, up for my first 20-something years, just about. Well, I forget where I was going with that. The gentleman who is going to be sharing this film and discussing it has a great resume. He's got a PhD in cell biology that he got from Brown University. And he also believes that there is a mind behind it all. And he's going to be talking about that. And for 34 years, he taught at Washington University Medical School, one of the top medical schools in the country, in cell biology. He's got a PhD in cell biology, won lots of awards as the best teacher at the school. He's in Who's Who in science. He's a brilliant guy, and I like listening to him a lot of the time. So let's start. It's a almost 10-minute segment of film. We'll be back to talk to you again at that point after he talks with you now, and we'll take calls if you want at that point in time. Let's go, guys. Let's show that first section of film.
I propose to address the following question. Does biology make sense without Darwin? The answer is yes, and that's pretty much the end of my talk. We can open for questions. I call it the evolutionary paradigm. The paradigm is everything that's permissible to believe. It's like a box. Everything inside the box is the whole of reality. Everyone in the box is quite sure there's nothing outside the box. That's a paradigm. Thinking outside of this box is just simply unthinkable. Anyone thinking of an idea outside this box is not simply wrong. Their views are unthinkable. And there is an evolutionary paradigm, and it goes pretty much like this. I think Julian Huxley spelled it out as well as any have. Our present knowledge indeed forces us to the view that the whole of reality is evolution, a single process of self-transformation. Now, when somebody believes that the whole of reality is evolution, that there is nothing else, that everything is just spontaneously self-transforming through natural processes, their best argument for evolution is two words. How else? There isn't any other way. They cannot think of a possibility that would not include just random chance processes. And because of this, we have what is called Dobzhansky's dictum. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. If people really believed this, you couldn't obviously allow a person who did not accept evolution to be a school teacher in any of the sciences. They couldn't be allowed to participate in the allied health or medicine. They would be closed from careers having anything to do with science. And sadly, there are people that believe that something like this is true, that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. Now, I could point to my own career and say, well, spent about 40 years having a brush with science. I had a double major in chemistry and biology in Minnesota way back in 1900. Got a PhD in cell biology from Brown, and spent a couple of summers Woods Hole Marine Biology Laboratory working on invertebrates, the sea cucumber Thyone briareus. That's a heartthrob for you. And a couple of years in research at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, and 34 years in the faculty of Washington University School of Medicine. And my students said I made sense of biology. In fact, I received a number of awards for teaching. And so I take issue with Dobzhansky's dictum, but you might say, well, you know, one person and you're a creationist, what would you know? Some evolutionists have come to the same conclusion that evolution really is non-essential, and that was my discovery. In the years that I taught at the medical school, I didn't bother to teach anything about evolution. I mean, at one time or another, I guess I've given a lecture on every organ system in the body with the exception of the pineal. I could never get pumped on the pineal. And I could have saved the last 5 minutes of the lecture, say a lecture on the kidney, to speculate on how we come to have kidneys before we had kidneys. But if I would have done that, I would have added nothing to my students' knowledge of renal physiology or anatomy. I would have contributed nothing to their ability to practice medicine. In short, it would have been a waste of their time. I never did it, and in 34 years in the faculty, I never had a single student ever complain. No one ever said, you know, we think Dr. Menton gives a decent lecture. It's just that we feel cheated he never gives us any evolution. Here's an evolutionist commenting on evolution, and I couldn't agree more with this gentleman. He said that while the great majority of biologists would probably agree with Theodosius Dobzhansky's dictum that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, most can conduct their work quite happily without particular reference to evolutionary ideas. That's an interesting admission from an evolutionist. He went on to say, and I quote, "Evolution would appear to be the indispensable unifying idea and at the same time a highly superfluous one." I couldn't agree with this person more. Evolution is obviously important to the person whose whole worldview is based on evolution, that everything is come into being by a process of evolution. I'm sure it's important to them in their minds. But at the level of empirical science, it contributes nothing. I found it possible to not only teach with, but publish papers with people who simply were evolutionists, for the most part, I suspect, agnostics, atheists. And I had no problem interacting, no altercations. Now, if we would have published a paper dealing with how did we come to have livers or kidneys or placentas or whatever, we'd have been in trouble. But as long as we stuck to empirical science, there wasn't a problem. You know, you might think, well, this is the only evolutionist that's ever raised the issue that evolution just might not be all that important. It could be superfluous. But just recently, in an article published in the Boston Globe, October 23 of 2005, Mark Kirshner, who is chairman of systems biology at Harvard Medical School and a very distinguished, well-known evolutionist, Dr. Kirshner said, "In fact, over the last 100 years, almost all of biology has proceeded independent of evolution, except evolutionary biology itself." I mean, if you're going to study evolutionary biology, you need evolution. I hope we're not going too fast, are we? No. He went on to say, speaking of his own field, "Molecular biology, biochemistry, and physiology have not taken evolution into account at all." Now, to be fair to Dr. Kirshner, he went on then to say that we're going to have to start taking it into account. He wasn't proposing that we ignore it. As a professional evolutionist, he wouldn't. But isn't it interesting? Over the last 100 years, we've had the most incredible breakthroughs in all areas of biology. Think of just molecular genetics, DNA, all of this by itself. And in many other fields of molecular biology and biochemistry and physiology. It has flourished over the last 100 years, and Dr. Kirshner tells us that it really didn't take evolution into account at all. It's useless. It's superfluous. What kinds of questions have they answered with evolution? For example, what about the origin of life? If you can't explain the origin of life, you might as well forget about everything else that follows. Dr. Paul Davies is a physicist. He's the director of the Astrobiological Research Center at Arizona State University, and he's very, very frank in his assessment of what is known. He said, and I quote, "How did stupid atoms spontaneously write their own software, and where did that very peculiar form of information needed to get the first living cell up and running come from? Nobody knows." And I would say you could add "nobody knows" to just about every non-trivial macroevolutionary claim that there is. Where indeed does new information come from? You know, Darwin wasn't even aware that there were such things as information in the cell. Well, the only real source of new genetic information is mutation. You're looking at mutant human cervical carcinoma cells here. They're called HeLa cells. They keep dividing and keep dividing. The person that they were taken from is long since deceased. As far as we know, these cells will keep dividing forever. Normally, cells only divide 15, 20 times, and that's it. It may be part of why we only live to be just so old. But in cancer, one of the things that can change is the cells can continue to divide, but of course they're highly abnormal. At this point, you wouldn't get a cervix out of this, and you certainly wouldn't get a human being out of these cells, but it's mutations that are really the source, if you are to have a source, of fundamentally new genetic information.
Welcome back to Truth Seekers. Vern, we went a little further than we wanted to there, but we'll pick up on that a little later. We wanted to stop at the point where that scientist Davy said information, where did that information come from that, Darwin didn't know anything about, but no life will exist without information, plant life, animal life, such a complexity in the DNA, information in the DNA, didn't know about it. Vern.
Well, even on that point, information is essentially a non-material entity. It's housed in the material realm. You can see a dot on a piece of paper or some magnetization on a disk or something like that. It's housed there, but the information that it represents is non-material, as is the code that is used to put the information into that material realm and then to receive it, to decode it by the user. Information is one of the greatest mysteries to the non-believer, but for us, we believe the Bible. God has intelligence. He's the creator of all things, and he gives us intelligence. He gives us information. The scripture calls Jesus the Word, and that's essentially what a word is. It transmits information.
Go back to the Word. I just want
to
just want to say briefly that go ahead. I just spaced through.
Okay. Well, I am...
Oh, I know what I was going to say. Okay. Evidence. A lot of people say there's no evidence for God. There's tons of evidence. It's all over the place. We'll talk about some of that. Thank you. Yeah. Go ahead, Vern.
Yeah. I don't see it. Oh, there it is. I was really pleased to see Dr. Menton's quotes by people in recent quotations citing the fact that really evolution has not provided anything substantive to science. It just provides an entire industry for people publishing in evolutionary biology. You write papers and papers, go to conferences, get big carbon footprints flying to conferences all over the world, but really has not provided anything substantive for science. But it's like maybe a parent will say, well, here's this toy. It's not a learning toy, but the kid's not going to swallow it and choke, so it's okay. There's nothing beneficial, but maybe nothing detrimental. And what we heard in the quotations from David Menton in this first clip was, well, there's nothing beneficial scientifically in evolution, which is correct. But there's much more to the story. It's that there has been a great deal historically very, very detrimental to science. I've got a list here. Let me just list these, and we can just talk about one of them.
Sure.
Just whenever there's time. Number one, evolutionary theory was retardant to the acceptance of germ theory. The evolutionary idea was a retardant to modern antiseptic surgery. The whole notion of vestigial organs, which really fundamentally is founded in the evolutionary idea, it hindered a lot of medical science. The notion of junk DNA hindered molecular biology. And where does the idea of junk DNA come from? The idea that, well, if we're evolving, there's some stuff that hasn't worked so well. It used to work, now it doesn't work. So there's a lot of stuff in the genome that's not working now. It's just leftover stuff like I would have in my garage from the cars that I used to have. I don't need it anymore. I just have not cleaned the garage. That was their concept of what the genome was, junk DNA. Even as recently as maybe the late 70s, Ono and even Francis Crick, one of the co-discoverers of DNA, he just wanted to throw God off the planet, under the bus. And he was one of the ones who said the same thing. Francis Crick promoted this idea also of junk DNA, as did Richard Dawkins, one of the famous God haters. Let me just, there's a longer list. There was a good quote I saw fairly recently that said, one of the greatest blunders of science, in the history of science, was to not recognize earlier the great amount of information that was in the non-coding DNA, that is in the portion of the DNA that isn't used to express proteins. Now we realize this whole area of epigenetics, that will be seen as one of the greatest blunders of science to not recognize that earlier. I knew that. Michael would have known that because we know God does not make junk. But if you begin with the wrong idea, you can waste a lot of time, a lot of money, government money, your life, washing that lab coat week after week, wasting your time. Will that story be in your children's history books that the whole idea of in medical science, where did it come from? The idea was that it wasn't created by God. It would be by chance. And that was what underlaid the whole idea of refusing to look at the whole genome. Just quickly, hindered the understanding of embryological development, wasted lives and careers of plant breeders, retarded the understanding of epigenetics, which is kind of what I've just talked about. One particular famous Nobel laureate wasted the rest of his career after he made one of the greatest discoveries, Werner discovering transcription or restriction enzymes, wasted the rest of his career because of an evolutionary idea that he followed. The evolutionary idea practically ruined the North American cod fishery, and the whole evolutionary idea undergirds a lot of unhealthy public health practices. There's a long list. We can talk about some of those. But what I'm saying here is it's not just like this friendly thing in the corner. It's okay. Just ignore it. Menton said it correctly, and that is it hasn't provided anything beneficial. But the real fact of history of the last 150 years, that it has really been very severely retarding to the advancement of science as well as to public health in many other areas. That's a serious issue. That's the little piece of toy that you don't give your kid that you can swallow and choke on.
If folks want to get in touch with you, your website maybe, can they reach you through your, about questions they might have about a specific area, how evolution retarded science?
I think on this one, I gave a talk at Design Science Association of Portland maybe about 8 years ago on this topic. I think there's still a video there someplace. They could Google Design Science Association.
On YouTube?
Portland. No, it's not on YouTube.
Well, how would these folks who are watching?
They could have to contact DSA and maybe they can get a copy.
Well, you know what?
Video.
I can put you in touch with him if you just go to our website, or my email. I'll give you my email, truthseekersws@yahoo.com. So truthseekers.ws, take away the dot, truthseekersws@yahoo. Just contact me and get you in touch with Vern. You can talk more about that. Because, the more I've studied this, and I became aware of this in the 1970s when I first heard Francis Schaeffer speak about the fact that Sir Isaac Newton, Michael Faraday, Robert Boyle, all these guys that were the most brilliant of minds in science believed that there was a God. They believed that the cosmos showed there had to be a God. In fact, I'd like to read you a quote from Einstein. Einstein, his three favorite scientists, I like to share this, Isaac Newton, Michael Faraday, and James Clerk Maxwell, were all creationists, and they believed there was a God. Most people like to say that Einstein didn't really believe in a God. Well, he believed there was a God. He just believed that God had kind of made everything and then let it just run by itself.
Spinoza's God.
Yeah, a deist instead of a theist. But let me just read you a couple of quotes by Einstein that'll kind of maybe shock a lot of you. He said, in the view of such harmony in the cosmos, which I, with my limited mind, right, he had a limited mind compared to us. In the view of such harmony in the cosmos, which I, with my limited human mind, am able to recognize, there are yet people who say there is no God. But what makes me really angry is that they quote me for support for such views. See?
That's interesting.
Einstein got ticked off. And there's so many who use his name on the internet under these different discussions on this subject that would like to say, well, he didn't really believe there was a God. Well, he believed there. He said, he talked about the equations. You could write the equations for physics in the universe on one or two pieces of paper and you'll have the whole thing. That harmony in these equations, that can't happen by chance, folks. There's no way that happened by chance. Vern, you were going to add something to that.
Yeah, just another thing about Einstein, and I think very few people are aware of it. He really resisted his concepts being referred to as relativity theory, because he saw coming down the line very serious potential social issues, and that people would say, well, if this is true in the physical world, then this must apply also in the moral world, the social world, that everything's relative. You have your truth, I have my truth, you have your truth, and we'll just all flow along together. He really resisted that because, first of all, he didn't really see it as quite being correct, and secondly, because he saw the social implications. In reality, where or why did he come to relativity? It wasn't because everything was relative, but because he was realizing that, you mentioned James Clerk Maxwell, the four laws of electromagnetism that James Clerk Maxwell came up with were not invariant relative to moving time frames. So he said, wait a minute, we need to solve this. And so as he got into that, that led him to relativity. In fact, trying to find the solution to that James Clerk Maxwell's laws should be invariant between moving frames of reference. He wanted to call it invariant theory. It didn't catch on. It would have been more correct, and it would not have given the social relativists so much ill-informed fuel for the fire for the changes that a lot of people want to bring into society. So,
you know,
that's a side issue. I didn't mean to get onto that. If you want to talk about some of these other things, Michael, it's okay. I could.
Oh, there are so many things to talk about. It's such poor science when you get into evolution, and as Dr. Menton pointed out, you don't use it if you're a doctor. You don't. There's nothing about evolution there. You don't need it. Yet, that's what's pushed upon high school and college students as soon as they enter university. They are bombarded with this viewpoint because the liberal establishment, and so many in the education at the higher levels, believe that we have to have one world together under the UN, a socialism, communism, pretty much the same thing.
Under man, but surely not under God.
And they believe that, and they don't believe there's, exactly a God, and they want to push that viewpoint. I mean, that's been written about all over the place. I mean, the fact that if you do an interview, so many academicians don't want God in the system, and so it's rampant in the school system. A great film on this, by the way, that we've shown on air a couple of times, and you can find it on YouTube, and it's incredible, is Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed by Ben Stein. He is the main guy in the film. And he interviews, of course, as you well know,
Richard Dawkins.
One of your favorite, quote-unquote, Richard Dawkins in there.
Richard Dawkins wanted to sue him afterwards because he didn't know he was going to tell everybody what he said. It was hilarious. Oh, I'm not supposed to laugh on camera, I guess.
No, you are. It's quite all right.
No, okay.
I like laughter on camera.
No.
It's a God-given thing. It would be a very stale universe without laughter.
It was just a hoot. Where Ben Stein finally arranged, he kind of led Richard Dawkins down to path, say, well, yeah, maybe life was created, but of course it couldn't have been created here. And we would know the processes by which that would have happened, but those processes would not have happened here either. If I was Jewish with you, I'd say, oy vey.
Now, I'm a Jewish believer in Jesus. We both. And I didn't become, unlike Vern, who grew up kind of in the church, I didn't become a believer. I was an agnostic bordering on atheist for many years and then searched through all sorts of things before I came to believe in Jesus 43 years or so ago. 72. I was 28 then.
If you want to run some more film, okay. Or I'd like to mention about germ theory. We have time? We want to do more?
No, that's okay. You can mention about it.
Okay.
I just like to say that that film is such an incredible film, Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed, in the classroom, in academia. He points in that film, he interviews people that were fired. They were great in their classes and teaching. They were fired and weren't given tenure because it was found out that they were creationists. Sir Isaac Newton would not be allowed to teach in a university today with his views if they knew starting out when he was a student, a grad student or whatever. Students hide this from professors a lot of the time because they know they can't get ahead with the viewpoint that they believe in creationism, that there's a mind. You have to believe in it when you really think about it for a while, unless you're avoiding God. And that's the problem. Jesus said people are really avoiding me because they don't want to be accountable to anybody. And yet a universe without justice is a universe without love. There must be justice involved in the universe, and we all know we're guilty about certain things. That gets into a whole other realm, but I want to go back to this information in DNA briefly, and bounce it back to Vern, then we'll show some more film. But you think about science, I mean, DNA, it's like writing this book in the language of English so it can be deciphered, translated. We can translate the DNA in our cells. Darwin didn't know anything about that. You don't know anything about anything if you don't know about that. Really, no, not much. You can't get a code, the DNA code. Bill Gates calls it, they all call it code. Look it up, you'll find DNA code. If you, a lot of people in the internet will say, well, it's not really a code. Of course it's a code.
Of course it's a code.
But they'll say they have to resort to anything to get people away from searching for the truth. It's truth seekers, seeking truth. But that code of information in all the simplest of cells, the simplest cell, a bacterial cell, has over 600 complex molecules in there. The probability, where are you going to get that information, a code? A couple of thoughts on that. Out in the woods, in the forest, are you going to come up, is there a code? Are you going to find a book like this written by the molecules out in the forest?
It's very easy.
It's like that, really. Go ahead, Vern.
You just drop the bottle of ink on the paper and the ink will create the code by itself, then put the letters on the page, then somehow do a Vulcan mind meld on the person who's going to read it to understand it. But this works, right?
And that's exactly what goes on in the cell. We can translate it. And the cell translated itself. It translates itself so it can make the cell wall, repair the cell wall, repair all the machines. You've got thousands of machines in each of your cells, our cells. We, as an adult, we have between 70 trillion and 100 trillion invisible cells, which have, all of them, hundreds if not thousands of machines, different machines, and then tens of thousands of copies. It's all invisible. But yet, we can watch it in action, moving nutrients in that one cell, all invisible. Such incredible complexity, and the code is here, and yet science doesn't even want to talk about where the information come from. They just, why don't you share what you're going to share, and then we'll get into the film.
Okay. Well, let me talk about the extended DNA. One time I got carried away, and I was thinking about, Jeannie, what's her face, with the National Center for Scientism Education. Not Jeannie.
Jean. I know.
No, not Jean. She's retired. But I was thinking Eugenie Scott. Yeah.
Scott.
I was thinking, I wonder what might be the place of eternal dwelling for Eugenie Scott. Maybe someplace like, what a problem it is, it's getting close to Christmas, to untangle your Christmas lights, okay? And you get out that string of Christmas lights that maybe goes across the front of the garage and down one side. Well, let's see. I wonder, let's see, if you take about 4 inches between the bulbs, and if you take how many elements are there in one DNA strand, I computed that if it were Christmas lights, the strand would go around the globe about 6 times. So if you have a strand of Christmas lights like that...
In one cell.
Every cell.
Right.
every cell. And also the strand has a way to copy itself. It's really cool. So with that much information, and she has to replace the lice, but she can't remember which one she has. She has to get everything in the right place. But then if you get it all twisted up, it's even more of a problem. That's how much information is in one strand of DNA in one cell. If it's that strand of Christmas lights with the bulbs every 4 inches, it would go around the globe about 6 times. So I wouldn't want the job of untangling that strand of Christmas lights. But I don't envy what the Bible shows as the final end of anyone in any fashion who denies God, the Creator, and His Son, the Lord Jesus, and especially in the same fashion that she or others who have the same message do, and saying the vicious things about God and His creation and His Son that they do. So, a lot of information, but it's kind of, God always has this stuff kind of in your face, try that. But when you blind yourself, you won't see it. That's self-deception. That's not deception unwilling. It's willing deception. You're being willingly deceived.
And yet, Vern, society is bombarded with the supposed facts that there really isn't much evidence for God, but there's a whole lot of evidence for evolution. When the truth of the matter, couldn't be further from that. This DNA evidence, this information, you can't get different creatures without lots of different information. Where does it all come from? And we're going to talk about mutations in the next section of film. But before we even get to that, I love to add this. In this book, one of my favorite books, Vern, In 6 Days, Why 50 Scientists Choose to Believe in Creation. There's one fellow in there, John Baumgartner. Now, all of them are great. I really recommend this book. Why they became creationists. Some of them used to teach evolution in college and universities. And then they said, no, there's no way.
Now, Baumgartner never did. He was always a Christian from the get-go. He got his master's in electrical engineering at MIT, and then. Yeah.
But the reason I bring him up is he ended up with a. Well, he started in electrical engineering.
He started electrical engineering, and then
he got a master's and a PhD
no, just a master's, and then he did several years of campus ministry. Then he realized that the science issues were so important. He went back.
You've met him, haven't you?
Yeah, and I think at UCLA, I think was where he got his PhD.
Space physics and geophysics.
Geophysics, and he wrote a very extensive mathematical model. A three-dimensional model, actually 2D modeling, 3D, to model the
Earth's mantle.
The Earth's mantle is very complex, and is a very nice code.
And he headed that up at Los Alamos laboratory. But the reason I bring him up is in this book he mentions the fact, and he used to publish these things in the newspaper for the 10,000 employees at Los Alamos and try and get people into discussion about this. And he said, for that bacteria, I started to talk about that. I learned about all of that stuff from people like him. In that one bacteria that's self-replicating, the simplest of living life, has over 600 complex protein molecules. They're strings of amino acids. He said a simple one, a short one would be 200 different amino acids. There's only 20 amino acids, but the way they're arranged sequentially could go into almost infinity. You have 200 of them arranged that way. The probability of getting that to happen, one molecule like that in a cell, of that just to spontaneously happen without a mind behind it, out in space, is impossible. He said that if you gave it 30 billion years for one molecule to happen, and you had 10 to the 12th power of interactions among all the molecules in the universe, and you said that you had 10 to the 80 molecules in the universe. He said, and that would be all molecules, 10 to the 80th power. Mm-hmm, that is right. 10 with 79 zeros after it. 10 times 10 times, that would cover 10 to the 80th power, all the molecules in the universe. Not in the solar system. I mean, not our solar system with the huge planet Venus, all the little molecules there, not all the molecules in our sun, but add to that all the suns in the universe, I don't know, 100 trillion suns with all these other galaxies. Everything in the universe, the probability of finding the one molecule in the universe would be the same. No, you wouldn't even get there. That would be 10 to the 110th power. He says it would be take you 10 to the 130th power a million billion times or a billion billion times more to get one molecule, but you need over 600 for the smallest replicating bacteria that you can find. And he said you can't find one. How is it going to come together in space or anywhere by chance? It can't. But in classes in science, in that film Expelled, Ben Stein points out that people are not even allowed generally to bring this up in class when they start talking about evolution. These questions, because you're not allowed to question it. They're so afraid of the truth. And yet, that's where we're heading, folks. I mean, the European Union, which is kind of fragmenting at the moment, they'll come back together, I do believe, sometime based on things in the Bible or a unified number of countries in the world like that. There was a group in Europe which formed the European Union. I'm forgetting the name of it at the moment, but anyhow, they've pushed for years that you should not be allowed to teach anything, to argue against creationism, that it's child abuse, to argue against evolution. That would be child abuse, they said, to argue against evolution. So they don't want to even allow this discussion in universities. And they're moving strongly in that direction, are they not? Who is that professor at Portland State University? He says it's mental illness to believe.
Oh, Peter Boghossian. I haven't heard from him.
To believe that there's a mind.
I think he's on sabbatical right now.
So, Einstein had that mental illness. Do you want to make one point before we jump into this next section of film?
Well, I got the example of germ theory and antiseptic surgery is really important. It's just an example, again, I'll elaborate a little bit, the ways that the whole evolutionary concept has really retarded science very seriously. Darwin published in 1859, but in that time the whole business of life by chance, throwing God out, it was kind of in the air, very much so throughout Europe and the British Isles. And so here's Louis Pasteur, very excellent chemist. Now we know who he was. He was the founder of microbiology. He discovered the germs. He is the founder of germ theory. Well, the Italians like to drink their wine, but the problem is the wines can spoil easily. So they hired this French guy to come down to Italy and help them solve the problem of wine spoilage. And that's the way he figured out that there has to be this thing coming in from outside that's causing the spoiliness. Those are the germs. That's where it came from. I don't know if they rewarded him handsomely. I suppose they did. He went back to France and applied that. Application of what he discovered has brought more for public health in the world than perhaps any other individual. Even as simple, it's not simple, but effective, pasteurization of milk, so the milk doesn't spoil, so you can feed more children. But also in the process, he also developed vaccines for anthrax. I had a note here, anthrax, the rabies, diphtheria. These are things that he did, but his work was very much resisted because it was all in the air. Like I said, this idea that kind of life comes from non-life by chance. And what he says, no, what we find is life comes from life. Same thing as Francisco Redi had discovered 300 years before, whatever it was, but they just didn't want to accept it. It seemed he was resisted strenuously. But because of his excellent work, it was finally realized, and the great benefits of his work were brought to the world. And because as a Christian man, he felt that his work was to be, as a child of God, it was to be a blessing to to the world, so he refused to even accept any royalties for his work in pasteurization. Basically, the copyright he released to the world to be used without royalties. A few years later, here's this guy named Joseph Lister in England. Also a Christian man, by the way. Very strongly a Christian man. And he became aware of the work that Louis Pasteur had done, and he began to develop the idea of antiseptic surgery. He was the founder of antiseptic surgery. He developed the surgical scrub, cleaning the operatory, for example, with carbolic acid. You'd run a sprayer and spray carbolic, a very mild acid. It would kill the germs in the air but would not damage tissue. And also, before there's a cut made. He was not accepted in England because of the evolutionary bias. And about that time, Darwin had published in 1859. So Joseph Lister went to Germany. In Munich, in the last years he was there, I don't know how you say failure rate, but the mortality rate, how many people die in a surgery, went from about 80% to very near zero. Because with the surgery, the greatest issue at that time was danger from infection, and how do you take care of the infection? Because of his understanding of what Pasteur had said, he developed the antiseptic surgery. He did this in Germany for quite some time with amazing success. They noticed that back in England, and I don't know what their motivation was to bring him back. Maybe it was the peasants needed the health, or maybe the royal kids were getting bones broken, needing surgery, falling off horses, playing polo and chasing fox through the forest or something. I don't know, but he was summoned back to England, and he became a surgeon in the royal university. He was a royal surgeon, so he became the surgeon to the royals. But his work then, look at the benefit it's brought to mankind. For how many years? 10, 15? In England, were people still dying from being cut in surgeries and dying of infections, even if it's just that 10 years. If you're one of those who died, you say, wow, this evolution thing hasn't done me any good, because the people who resisted Louis Pasteur, the people who resisted Joseph Lister, on what ideological basis? It was on the ideological basis of evolutionism, that life comes from non-life by chance. Those are just two examples. There's so much more, so much more. It's toxic. Evolution, the whole concept, is just toxic to science. It's toxic to society.
We need to talk more about that in
it's
other
toxic.
programs.
Yeah.
Let's jump into this next section of film. It's a few minutes long. We'll see you then.
Yeah, they get carried away.
Well, the only real source of new genetic information is mutation. You're looking at mutant human cervical carcinoma cells here. They're called HeLa cells. They keep dividing and keep dividing. The person that they were taken from is long since deceased. As far as we know, these cells will keep dividing forever. Normally, cells only divide 15, 20 times, and that's it. It may be part of why we only live to be just so old. But in cancer, one of the things that can change is the cells can continue to divide, but of course they're highly abnormal. At this point, you wouldn't get a cervix out of this, and you certainly wouldn't get a human being out of these cells. But it's mutations that are really the source, if you are to have a source, of fundamentally new genetic information, not just shuffling the deck, but bringing in new genes. And what do we know about mutations? Well, Dr. James Crow, who's chairman of genetics at the University of Wisconsin Medical School, knows a bit about genetics, I suspect. And he says that the typical mutation, thank God, is very mild. It usually has no effect, we should say perhaps no obvious effect, but shows up as a small decrease in viability or fertility. Now, this is interesting because natural selection, which we hear as being the explanation for everything, it's not chance, the evolutionists will tell you, it's natural selection. Takes everything out of the realm of chance, makes it inevitable. Wonder how many people here could define natural selection. Particularly if I were to say, I'll allow you 2 words. Natural selection can be defined in two words. It's called differential reproduction. Basically, do you leave more offspring or don't you? It has nothing to do with whether you're the biggest, meanest animal in the forest. I mean, you go around kicking all the other animals and taking their food away. If you don't leave any offspring, what's the difference? It's differential reproduction, simple as that. And yet, Dr. Crow tells us that the typical mutation shows up only as a small decrease in viability or fertility. Precisely the opposite direction of what we want for natural selection, where we want to have a progressive increase in the number of offspring left. One gentleman who studied this whole business of mutations and natural selection a great deal is Muthu Chimera. He's an evolutionary geneticist of some renown. And Chimera came up with what's called Chimera's distribution. It shows the effects of mutations on a population. Now, look at Chimera's distribution. The first interesting thing is his curve in red doesn't even come up to neutral because he says he doesn't know of any truly neutral mutations. So he stops his curve short of neutral. You may want to check out the curve on the right side, the beneficial mutations. He doesn't know of any beneficial mutations for organisms living in their normal environment, in other words, apart from exposure to drugs and what have you. As we tail off to the left, we notice they become lethal. Now, here's the thing that's intriguing. Chimera came up with this. He said, we have a no selection zone. You can't select for the suboptimal mutations in the no selection zone because there's not enough effect on the phenotype. There's too many layers between the mutation in the DNA and the final phenotype and its effect on leaving offspring. Most mutations just fall below the radar. And you know what this means? It means we are collecting them. It's called a genetic load. In every day and every way, that genetic load increases. You know, if there were some beneficial mutations, and I just threw this one in on the right side. I mean, if there were any, Chimera didn't put any in, but if there were, they would be small in number. And of course, they would not be immensely, outrageously, uproariously positive mutations. They would very likely fall in the no selection zone. Well, I wanted to share with you some particular things that I've thought about, some things that I've worked with, published on over the years.
All right, back with Truth Seekers. Vern, why don't you jump in? I was going to say something leading into that, but I got so caught up in what he was saying about the fact that mutations can't get you any. Oh, I know kind of what I wanted to say was that besides, all this evidence in DNA and codes and mutations, the fact that it doesn't fit the idea of evolution at all, and we started the program with this great mystery out there, where'd the first molecule come from in the universe? It had to come from somewhere. The Big Bang guys, the evolutionists say, well, it just happened. That's a mystery, or the mystery of where did God come from? It's one or the other. Either there's a mind behind it, or it just kind of happened in the natural. But where'd the first molecule come? It's a total mystery. No one. But God, besides giving the evidence that we've been talking about here on this program in science, which overwhelms the evidence for evolution in science, besides that, when you go into the Bible, God says, I'm going to tell the future for you folks so you'll know I'm God. Not only am I going to show it in creation, and he says that over and over in Scripture, but then he says over and over, I'm going to tell the future and I'm never going to be wrong. Go to our website to check out some of the prophecies. Vern, you wanted to share something.
Oh, I do. How much we have? We have about 3 minutes, 4 minutes. One of the most interesting things in the book of, well, there's so many interesting things in the book of Genesis, but one of those is Genesis chapter 49. Jacob, who has gone to Egypt because of the drought, the famine in the land of Canaan, is there on his deathbed with his children around him, and he's blessing his children. And as Christians, we always focus on his blessing to Judah, the fourth son. So to him, he said, from you the scepter shall not depart until Shiloh comes. That is, from Judah will come the line of kings. Didn't say the first king, but once there's a king from Judah, there will be no more kings not descended from Judah, his fourth son, until Shiloh comes, means the great ruler, the Messiah, Jesus, who is also descendant of Judah. So we think of that, but we don't look so much at his blessing to Joseph. Now, just as this is Genesis chapter 49, I'll just start by reading verse 20. He's going to bless Asher. For Asher, his food shall be rich, and he will yield royal dainties. Oh, verse 19 there. For Gad, raiders will raid at him. He will raid at their heels. Well, I guess those are nice blessings if you're a son. Then he comes to the blessings for Joseph. Joseph is a fruitful bough by a spring. Branches run over a wall. The archers bitterly attacked him and shot at him and harassed him, but his bow remained firm. His arms were agile from the hands of the mighty one of Jacob. From there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. From the God of your father who helps you, and by the Almighty who blesses you with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that lies beneath, blessings of the breasts of the womb. The blessings of your father have surpassed the blessings of my ancestors, the utmost bound of the everlasting hills. May they be on the head of Joseph and on the crown of the head of the one who is distinguished among his brothers. A most effusive blessing. I believe, I've just been looking recently, I believe that the famous Egyptian called Imhotep was in fact Joseph. That's another story, but just breaking news of about a week ago, it appears that the very first alphabet in the world was Hebrew, and it appears that the very first writing of it was actually inscribed on a stone by the hand of one of two Joseph's sons, that son being Manasseh. The very first alphabet in the world. It wasn't using the alphabet today that you have in Hebrew, but that's where it came from. It was an alphabet using hieroglyphic characters. So the use of alphabet has brought a great blessing to the world. If Imhotep is also Joseph, we have the greatest origins of surgery, architecture, so many things. And so this whole blessing, we've been discussing on this program, Michael, about the evidences for the Jewish people in Egypt. And here we have, it was a stone slab. It was uncovered, I think, by the Pinches family, probably in early the 20th century. And Pinches was a very bright guy. He was a good archaeologist. He realized it was an alphabet of some kind, did not know what. About 4 years ago, Dr. Goldwasser in Israel said, oh, they look like it's an alphabet, but it was a guy only about 10 days ago has published and is recognized it was Hebrew. It was the Proto-Hebrew alphabet, the first in the world. But alphabets have brought a blessing to all of the world.
Let me just jump in there too. Yeah. He has the name Joseph with Ephraim and Manasseh on some slabs that they've discovered in Egypt. So here are these Jewish names at that time period, around 1842 BC, so that's almost 4,000 years ago, that family there in Egypt. And he's published this book. He says, you're going to see that he uses those letters that he deciphered from the hieroglyphics that they made into the Hebrew alphabet to decipher other things that could not be translated before.